Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much indeed. So,
fascinating. Thank you. Well, I just had one question on my way out. Where does the equality with Nancy on cum and with the will? I mean, in my study with Nancy, that the will is a very important understanding of the human. And how are you thinking with cum and partage in your understanding of equality?
Thank you. That's very much at the heart of all of this. Is tied up with this whole idea of singular plurality and the just measure of the will. So l'avec, the cum is again this idea of the singular plural spacing that Nancy is saying love is the experience of. So absolutely right, it all starts there.
Okay. Great.
I've got bags of questions.
Me too.
Goes.
Well, not bags, but
Plenty, yeah. Where should we start?
do you want to kick off?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Very, very wonderfully put. Could you just say a little bit more about the distinction between eros and agape?
Yeah.
Because clearly you mentioned agape and its sort of outcoming caritas, and your emphasis on love thy neighbour at the end was sort of very important in terms of gathering all the force of what you said together. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about, how Nancy distinguishes between the two and the relation he places between the two. Within the context of, the way you brilliantly sort of untie the opposition between thought and action, and the is and the ought. I wonder whether in there's sort of an originary sort of weakness, not on your part, but of the distinction that you showed so well was a false distinction of the distinction between sort of affect and intellect, which seems to be sort of at the heart of a lot of what you're saying, part of it. Because I'm minded to think that even for someone like Plato, Eros has an important role in carrying us towards the idea. So at that originally foundational moment, the distinction between intellect and affect is not operative. And so the question I have is how far, I can see the way the sort of the agape side of love is what brings us towards others and generalises and universalises, but whether a lot of the effective force that you've been talking about, and the feeling and the pushing, that actually connects or shows these two realms to actually originally be connected in the wonderful ways you showed, is actually not more part of Eros than agape.
Yeah, Nancy is, in Un Pensée Finie, careful not to make the sort of distinction that you're suggesting it's unhelpful to make. He says that love is constitutively this cutting across of these oppositions, and I think that comes out really powerfully in this 13th quotation. L'amour est double, conflictuel ou ambivalent. Chez tous ces couples d'opposition ces couples d'opposition constituent la structure même et la vie de l'amour. So when he talks about love, he says we've already gone too far when we say, over here you've got caritas, over here you've got eros, because love itself, as he's understanding it, is the cutting across the contradiction of that sort of opposition. And he sees that at work in the definitions of love themselves. So absolutely. It isn't that he's singling out caritas here, although he does privilege it in adoration when he talks about Kierkegaard. But it's love in as far as it is irreducible to any one of these definitions of these terms.
Great, that's brilliant. I have other questions, but do you want to?
Probably work our way towards something more like a general discussion, I suspect, rather than two of us interrogating you, perhaps. But nonetheless, well, we're still in interrogation mode. I wondered whether in the Nancy, well, the way that he talks about love, as you showed, very often it would be possible to, as you say, as you showed, as he shows in a way, it would be possible to replace the word love with the word sens, and therefore it would also be possible to replace the word love or sens with the word différence, with an A. In that it's playing the one way of thinking about the kind of structural role that love is playing in this account, particularly towards the end of what you were presenting there, Chris, in sort of final sort of quarter of what you were presenting, where love is, in a sense, not just beyond these oppositions, but also, is also sort of irreducible to, and also, in a sense, the condition of possibility of the oppositions in the first place. So it's a kind of what Derrida in relation to différence would call a quasi-transcendental. Now, so there's also a move that he's making that you brought out brilliantly, I think, but that one could be critical of, which is as a constant move of regression. That you say, well, here's a question to this term, and the move then is to say, but the term is prior to your question. And that raises a couple of particular questions for me, I think. I'll go with one of them now and come back to another one, I think, maybe in a minute. Which is that I'm not sure how far. Well, let me put it another way. That's not right, actually, because you've moved us a long way in terms of the is and ought here. But I'm worried that there's something presupposed as a given and as desirable in Nancy's position as you've outlined it, and that is then that the presupposition of that desirable element or position is transmuted into this quasi-transcendental position of the term in question. And I'm worried about that's a sleight of hand. I suppose that's partly what's concerning me. So one way of putting this, I'll try and be a bit more precise. One way of thinking about what might be a kind of slippage here, and which in ways this is the same slippage as the call and response problem, I think, is to say that sometimes love means an ethos, and sometimes it's the quasi-transcendental. And it's what happens when you choose the word love rather than the word sens or différence is that it does exactly that work. That if you replaced love here with sens or différence, it couldn't also mean an ethos. And that what it might be that what allows love to play the role that you've shown it as playing is the fact that it has that it is simply being positioned in such a way as to do two jobs at once. Therefore it is, as it were, the answer to the question of how to relate these two dimensions, because it simply has its foot in both camps. I'm sorry, has a foot in both has a foot in both camps. So I don't know whether that's any of that is at all clear. I don't know, and I'm sorry if it's not. It feels extremely unclear to me as I try to say it. But that's for now, that's my first go at a possible anxiety here, I think.
Let me then have a first go at a possible response. We'll see where we end up. You started by raising the possible homology between love and sans indifférence. As I understand it, the difference there is that love is the intimate way in which love is tied with address and adoration, and I don't see that as much coming through in Derrida. So I think rather than a general condition, love is being used by Nancy in a way that immediately implies a position and an action.
Can I leap in there though? Because isn't that what is, that doesn't change that's where calling it love allows us to import an ethos into what is a quasi-transcendental. So that's very helpful, because that actually allows me to clarify what I think my question is.
But isn't it the case at that point that it's not just that we, or that he or the one has imported just any old ethos in? This happens to be the ethos that holds itself with respect to singular plurality.
Yes. Yes.
So it's not, there's no arbitrariness.
But that's already. That's where the presupposition comes in, because then that's already a decision on the basis of a pre-existing evaluation of the desirability of holding oneself in that way.
But isn't it in a sense? So if we take the address and the adoration, isn't it in a sense impossible not to? So and this is a very Rancièrean argument at this point. Yeah. If I try to argue for inequality, I'm supposing equality. And that there are differences between the way that Rancière does that and the way that Nancy does that. Yeah. But essentially, I think it's the same thing. You try and in your address to me now, it's there. It's already there. So it's not up for grabs. It can only be denied.
Yes. See, I don't think I buy that. I think. Because I think that's again where calling it love imports a way of thinking about what is implied by that structure, by the acceptance and the embrace of that structure, that is very thick in evaluative terms, and that I'm not sure that is necessary. I think what is necessary. You could argue. I mean, I don't know. I think I'm more convinced by that than there's an element of devil's advocate to this. I think. But you could argue that what is implied is an affirmation of the value of, and so on and so on and so on. So it's an affirmation of the ground of possibility. But calling it love then makes that affirmation imply something ethical about the way we might then want to relate to each other given that ground of possibility. And that's what I mean about that name, the necessity or otherwise of that name.
Yeah, I think two things. Let me just scribble something down. I think the quibble is just over the name, isn't it, here? Because as I understand Long Sens, you argue for something very similar to this, in the way that humanity is indestructible. Would that be fair?
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is it right to circumscribe the question, is it right to call this thing that we're talking about love? Well, I think one thing it does do, if I play devil's advocate for Nancy at this point, is that I just wonder whether it gets under the skin of this notion of a ground of possibility as opposed to what then follows it. See, I just wonder whether it cuts across that as well. You know, so it's not as if we've got something that's a ground of possibility and then we do some ethics afterwards. But as I understand it, there's a trajectory in all of this that seeks to cut across that sort of, you know, first there's and then there's this. And one thing that love does, among others perhaps, is that it, exactly in the way that you're pointing to, it disrupts that idea, well, hold on, you can't have love there because that's the ground of possibility, and then you've got to, you know, sort of move on. But it doesn't allow that neatness.
Yes. I think in a way what I'm saying is I think that what Nancy's doing with love here is the same as, and I should be saying this obviously because as you pointed out, that's where I got it from, is the same move that I'm making in L'Homme Saint as well, but that therefore it has the same problems attached to it. That it's that saying exactly as you say, that that the argument is that love as the name for, as it were, the ground of possibility, refuses that separation out of ground of possibility and then ethical response to that. But the love is already there, as it were, so in the ground of possibility. So, you know. Now, I suppose what I'm worrying at is the fact that there is that's, as it were, just an assertion, and the interest of asserting that is to make it so. Is to insist that the value is originary, and that insistence is not can be accepted or not, but only on the basis of whether we decide that value is something we want to value anyway. So that's probably what I meant about a regressive structure.
If I'm understanding correctly what you're saying there, I think I'd want to put that in the context of what I was talking about towards the end of the paper, in terms of the risk of love. So to say that's just an assertion, I think I don't think it quite captures everything that's going on. I think it's this notion again of adoration. You know, to say it's just an assertion is to elide, to some extent perhaps, the truth that this is a position taking as well. So it's not just an assertion, it's also a performing of what I'm talking about.
Sorry, no, what I mean is that it can't, it's in a sense, this is where the regressive structure comes in, because what I meant by it's just an assertion is there is no way for that position and that the taking of that position to do anything other than insist by taking that position on the value of what it presents as a value.
But by virtue of what do we want it to do something else?
What I mean, but that's what I mean about it has the same problem. Has the same problem as ontological equality. Then, But isn't, sorry, just let me try and ask you a question if I could at this stage. Doesn't ontological equality still sit within this, as we have been understanding it until now, doesn't it still sit within this is-or problem? So we've got an ontology. Now what are we going to do? Yeah.
But I think
but sorry, go on. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to go and say I think that's what I'm trying to get away from.
Yeah.
So to that extent,
I
think that the way I'm trying to present things here is a little bit different.
I wonder if I just jump in, because it seems to me it may be, as you suggested, that what's happening with the love having a foot in both camps, or 2 feet in both camps, could be an animal, it is a question perhaps of naming and describing something that Nancy has already been doing in a different way without that language. So if we go back to Une pensée finie, I wonder whether the 2 sort of names of love, one this sort of ethos, another this sort of more fundamental thing that is everywhere, that might be equivalent to sens, is not already described in a certain way, because he says things like an essential finitude of sense will demand a finite thinking. And so the practice of finite thinking is responding, and therefore it's a kind of as a practice, it's kind of an ethos, to a necessity of finite sense and a demand of finite sense. So there seems to me that seems to me to play the same distinction that we're working out with this double sort of side of love. Now, either the problem is resolved in both cases in the way that you've said that love might resolve it, and perhaps love resolves it better than he had previously, that he's still trying to maybe. Or the whole problem that you've been talking about actually is at work in both cases. But it seems to me that in both cases you have an experience of finitude, unbounded, described in all the ways we might want to describe it. And that experience demands, necessitates a certain kind of response, a finite thinking, a kind of an ethics of singular plurality, which responds to the ontology of singular plurality. And I guess it's that move from one to the other which gives you into the circle of justification. You've tried to cut through that circle by saying it doesn't need to justify itself. And I wonder whether it does come down to the idea, and this is problematic, of this being an experience. Something that is effectively felt. And I think that the language of love describes that, and your language of pushing and shoving works brilliantly to describe that. But I think it might already be there in an earlier text such as Une pensée finie, for instance, when Nancy talks about the sublime, and the sublime not just as a category within Kantian thought, but as a destiny of art after Kant and of thought after Kant. It works as a destiny and as a necessity of an experience of finitude. And it's that affective, that collapsing of the feeling, the experience, but also the necessity at the end of logical and metaphysical thought, and a necessary outcome that makes the demand and seems to try to connect the 2 together. Now, I'm not sure if that's clear now, but it seems to me that he may be sort of reworking the same thinking, but with a different language, and it either, in both cases, solves the problem that we've raised, or doesn't. And it's the question whether you need to appeal to the ground of justification, or whether the experience of sens, of finitude, as a historical collective outcome, he would assert, and there's a big assertion there, because obviously others would disagree with it. Whether that's enough to motivate all this. And I suppose one of the questions that, do you mind if I just round off with a question there, is the question of justice, because in your talk, I think you brilliantly sort of differentiated between sort of justice as an order of calculability and equal distribution, and clearly moved away from that, or showed that Nancy moves away from that, really. And I was wondering what you're thinking of the way in which Nancy consistently, in relation to the term justice, uses the phrase rendre. Justice is always, nearly always, in Nancy, something that needs to be rendu. It's something that can be done as well, but he really uses the term rendre a lot. And of course it means, in French, to do justice, but also to return, to give back. And I wonder whether justice is also caught in this 2 feet in both camps, in the sense that there's something about the singular plural of presentation, of shared, of the with, which is itself a kind of a justice, just already is in and of itself. And justice therefore needs to be given back to it, because it may have been denied in an order of injustice. I'm wondering if that can be related back to our problematic, and whether it helps solve anything any further, or just repeats the problems that we've encountered.
Okay, thank you. Let me have a sort of a scattergun approach, and then anything that I don't pick up you can come back on afterwards. I'm just a little bit nervous of this language of having a foot in 2 camps, because I think that one of the great values in what Nancy's doing is he's just putting a cat among the pigeons of this notion that there are 2 camps that are presupposing now how we're to think in terms of them. So I think love is doing something to the notion of 2 camps, as well as situating itself in relation to them. What you mentioned about experience, that was fascinating. In a sense, that is philosophy, isn't it? It's telematsing. You know, it's this wonder and awe that then leads on to, that gives a push or a shove to thinking. So I think in that, Nancy is situating himself, you know, as a philosopher, in evoking, in appealing to experience, rather than, in a sense, blinking first or bottling it in relation to philosophical rigour. I'm willing to go with you quite a long way in saying that what Nancy's doing here with love is not incommensurable with what he was doing earlier on in relation to finitude and sense. I'm not trying to argue, and I don't think that l'adoration sort of marks some watershed. So this, you know, we must think of Nancy as the Nancy before l'adoration and the Nancy after. I think that there absolutely is a continuity. But I do think there's a difference in emphasis, and I think it's really important. And I think it's the difference between a demand and a push. So in the way that you're articulating the question, you quite rightly return to this notion of a demand, and you know, the notion of a call is similar. So something from outside interpolates me, and then I have to, you know, what do you do with the demand? You have to decide whether to heed it or not. And I think that's, even if it's only a difference of emphasis, I think that is significantly different from a push, which is, well, there are a number of connotations. It's always already acting, it's always already implicated. So if I'm faced with a demand, there's a moment of evaluation in relation to that. Should I or should I not? You know, okay, so this equality exists. Do I verify? Do I not? Okay. Whereas a push is, I'm already doing something in relation to this equality. Is what I'm doing what I want to keep on doing? So there isn't any fence to sit on. There's no moment before already acting. And it's also already, I think it's easier to reel out from a demand than a push. And that I think there's a notion in the push of compulsion, you know, with the force of pulsion there, in the way that there isn't with this relatively, by comparison, sedate notion of call and response. So it may be a difference in emphasis, but I think there's also a point at which a difference in emphasis becomes a difference in kind. You know, if the emphasis is sufficiently different, it is, you end up with something that looks very different to what there was before. And I think that's perhaps a better way to characterise the trajectory here. Yeah, there's continuity, absolutely. We can map this back onto finitude, but I'm not convinced that we can do that exhaustively, and that something important isn't happening with that Nancy is trying perhaps to indicate with bringing in this notion of love, which is a departure. It's a milestone that there's something different going on as well to what was going on before. I think it's also worth pointing out that I'm not in a sense primarily concerned in particular with trying to justify love to someone who is not yet convinced of it. I'm primarily trying to think about us, myself, in a sense locate the problem within me. The problem is that I'm not acting. What do I think about that? Rather than how do I convince everyone else that action is necessary. So again, a different emphasis there that does bring out a different response to those themes. And finally, just a word on the notion of justice in relation to rendre. It's as you know, it's all over l'adoration, the renvoi of love, and I think that links back again to the address, sending and receiving, address of love. So yeah, very, very much at the centre of these concerns.
Thank you.
That's very interesting, Chris, what you say about it's not so much a matter of trying to convince other people. Because there is something in it, I think one way to characterise what the sort of line of questioning that I've been pursuing is my sense that and again what is the the criticism that is there to be levelled rightly against the kind of ontological equality thing, both in Nancy and as I had a go at it as well, is that it presupposes the value that it needs to establish. So, as you put it quite rightly, the desirability of equality is presupposed. Why should this equality be normative? Which I think is absolutely right. But that, and that I think is in the. I don't think Nancy has got around that by talking about it in terms of love, alternatively. I think that problem is still very much there. In a sense, it seems to me that what he's doing is, I mean, partly from understanding this through your tremendous exposition, which actually makes it a lot clearer than it might otherwise be, I think. In a way, what he's doing is saying, yes, the value is already there. So it turns the objection into simply an assertion. Now that's explicit, I think, in quotation 9, where he says l'amour des autres indique simplement la valeur vers laquelle nous sommes tournés du seul fait de notre existence fortuite, which does exactly that. Yes, the value is already there. Now, that's useless when it comes to attempting to convince anyone who isn't already convinced. But it may be helpful as a way of talking about these things that will motivate people who are disposed to agree that yes, that value, that is indeed the value, and it is indeed already there. Mm-hmm. But as I say, it's not. That's what I meant earlier by calling it an assertion as well. I think that it has no argumentative traction. It has oddly, to use a Rancière term, it has declarative traction, but no argumentative traction.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think I want to disagree with that, but let's assume it did have argumentative traction. What good would that do?
Yeah.
So where would we be? We'd have an argument.
Yeah.
But it's not a question, I think, and I think that Nancy's really answering it. What we need is not a reason, it's enthusiasm.
Yeah.
And you don't get enthusiasm by giving someone 10 reasons to be enthusiastic,
Yeah.
necessarily, alone,
Yeah.
And so I think yes, but that's not the game. And in a sense it would almost be counterproductive, because then we'd be back in this circle of thinking thought to action within thought.
Yeah.
And we'd be able to write some more papers and do some more thinking and fool ourselves about it once more.
But he's trying to persuade us that we should be enthusiastic, though, isn't he?
But I don't think it's just a case of reason. You see, so I'm not saying enthusiasm's got nothing to do with thinking, but I think the way the stick needs to be bent back is not that way, but the other way. So we're more prone to think enthusiasm is all about thinking than we are prone to think enthusiasm has nothing to do with thinking. Given the milieu in which this is taking place. So I think what needs to be said most clearly is it's not just about thinking, rather than the other way.
Yeah.
And enthusiasm is caught, isn't it, more than taught. Yeah. And I think that is the sort of dynamic that I understand as be trying to wrestle with in this poussée and in this all this conjuring that he does with the contradiction of contradiction and non-contradiction, all that it's this refusal to let it just be. Let me give you reasons why.
Do you think the effective sort of dimension of his writing itself sort of bears, above and beyond its reducible arguments and propositional assertions or whatever, that there is a contagion of enthusiasm that he exposes us to, or is that going too far? Because there's this constant sort of manoeuvre in Nancy's writing to be exposing thought to its excess. Yes. And it's the excess is not something that can be argued for or determined or subject to propositional truth saying. It's something that is exposed in the experience of thought at the limit of thought. So do we encounter and feel adoration, or we move closer to that affect of enthusiasm by following the line of his thinking, the movement of his thinking up to its limit and beyond? Does he take us closer to it, even if he can't give us 10 reasons to experience it?
Right. Almost like Wittgenstein's ladder at the end of the Tractatus.
Certainly in some kind of analogy with that, yes.
Well, yeah, I think there has to... I mean, you can go too far, can't you? I mean, there's just, you can say, oh, with Nancy, it's not what he says, it's the way that he says it. And that clearly is not the case.
It's more rigorous and exact.
Absolutely.
That's too
but it's that now we're back to the relation between faith and reason. You see, so faith is not that which happens when you leave reason behind. It's that which reason needs to be reason in the first place. That reason's holding itself to not being more than reason. It's blind spot of reason is faith. So similarly, it's not as if in order to be moving us, Nancy needs to stop being rigorous. You see, at that point.
It's a question whether the rigour is exactly the production that leads you to that limit at which the exposure...
Well, I think that would be a very Nancean way to think about it. Yeah, it's hard to think how it could work otherwise within Nancy. And so, I think, in a circumscribed way, absolutely. Yeah, I think what I want to avoid saying is all we need to do is go and read a book, and then we'll be wonderfully enthusiastic. I think that again is reducing, and I'm not suggesting you're doing this for a second, is reducing the complexity of what's going on. But yes, I mean, to the effect that you can't have information without adoration, in these terms that Nancy's putting it, well, you can't read without that. And to the effect that he's gesturing and following the trace of that through, he's helping us to recognise that, perhaps, as well. It is exciting.
And what I think you're helping us to recognise is that that move was what was going on all along, even when it didn't look like that was what was happening, as it were. In the incitement, to use that word, the incitement to enthusiasm, which is what you've been able to show us, has sort of become the focus then in l'adoration. That incitement to enthusiasm is probably, it would be fair to say, therefore, and this is a way of inverting what I've been running with so far. That incitement to enthusiasm is actually what's also largely going on in the earlier ontological equality discourse. The difference being that that where the earlier ontological equality discourse thought it might be able to proceed via this sort of ideas of call and response, implying that this is necessary because it's inscribed ontologically. Actually what that was doing was everything that was important about that discourse was in the strength of the claim. It really is necessary because it's inscribed in it. But then that, as you've shown us, just gets you to the is-ought problem. But in a way, what you've shown us that he's done is to take what was really going on there all along, namely just the strength of the claim, and to make that now into what is into what's being presented.
And also the effective dimension of the necessity and the demand, because I think I was very persuaded by what you were saying about the sort of the distinction between demand and adoration, and it could be an important sort of decisive shift from one thing to another rather than sort of pure continuity or a redressing of the same thing. But at the same time, that effective dimension of the demand as an experience, as a necessity that one feel and not just sort of argue for, was, I think, always there. But this seems to have sort of perhaps decisively magnified that dimension, and actually given it more rigour and precision, perhaps, which is precisely what is needed. And as Derrida always said, he is a very exact and rigorous thinker.
Yes. And as well, I think, to embellish that a little, to embroider what you just said, I think both the affect and the thinking are effects of symptoms of an ethos as well. So it's always triangulated. You don't. And this is what I think is important for understanding the is-ought question. It's not a question that plops out of some topos uranios that suddenly, is itself wonderfully a view from nowhere that we've got to reply to. It's important to recognise it itself as coming out of a particular ethos. Why would one ask that particular question in this situation? Because one would have a certain way of holding oneself in the world that would, predispose one to do that. And that as well would have certain affects and certain thoughts to do with it. And I don't think that's cheating. I think that's just trying to understand that we're all, it's Pascal again, we're all on board.
But the truth of it will be in the movement that you take through all those moments, or the sense of it being true will not be in terms of assertions, but in terms of that complex path of thought through all those moments in which that truth is sort of exposed.
Yes.
Again, to use Nancy language, but just to sort of differentiate it from sort of propositions and assertions, because that doesn't seem to be how it wants to.
And therefore, I think where we've got to in this. One place we've got to in this whole discourse on equality now is that this understanding of it, I think, you know, holds together. It's got its assumptions, absolutely. You know, show me the position that hasn't. But it is holding itself in the world in a particular way. And now someone comes and asks the question, how do you get from this to an art? Because, you know, you can say, talk to me about the way, where that's coming from, how you're holding yourself. You know, and this position is at such a point now where it can say, you know, where the other position can't just come and say that's self-contradictory. That doesn't work. You know, so I don't think it is. You know, it's got its assumptions, but that's different. And it can say, well, talk to me about where you're coming from on this, how you're thinking, the quality, why you think this is our question is the right one to be asking now. You're not in sort of accusatory, oh, how I got you way, but you know, let's acknowledge that we've got two equals going on here, you know, and talk about that.